Hi, my name is Carlos Ona, a member of Vocation Awareness Committee here at the Archdiocese of Edmonton. This session you're about to participate is entitled The Weeds and the Wheat, Vocations and Communities with a painful history. What this session all about is it will highlight the generational traumas caused by residential schools and the role of the church and the religious communities. I am honored to introduce to you our two members of Vocational Awareness Committee here at the Archdiocese. Sister Rezebeth Noceja. She is of Filipino descent and a member of Sisters of Providence in Temporary Vows. She works as a social worker in the inner city, dealing with issues that our indigenous people are facing today. Also, her co-presenter in this workshop, Father Mark Blom, a professed and ordained member of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. He is presently an associate pastor of Sacred Heart Parish of the First Peoples here in Edmonton and has ministered in numerous Indigenous and Métis communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan. He was a vocation director for the Oblates for 6 years. Father Marx articulates the transformational elements of Christian spirituality that can make the liberation of the gospel a reality in our lives. Without further ado, please let me welcome Sister Rezebeth and Father Mark.
Welcome everyone to the 2023 NAVFD conference, and this portion of our presentations is entitled The Weeds Among the Wheat, Vocation Ministry or Vocation Work among Communities that have a Painful History. And my name is Father Mark Blom. I'm a missionary oblate, and I'm working at Sacred Heart Church of the First Peoples in Edmonton. And I'd like to have my co-presenter, Rezebeth, say hello.
Hello, everybody. My name is Rezebeth Noceja. I am a sister in initial formation with the Sisters of Providence in Western Canada. I currently reside in Edmonton. And right now, I'm on my 4th year of temporary vows. And today, I will be sharing experiences related to what Father Mark will be presenting.
Thanks, Rezebeth. So as we begin, we really want to create a safe space. Maybe just go back one. We want this presentation to be a very safe space because the topics we're going to be looking at are very, very sensitive. And we can often react defensively, especially when we examine some of the history of the church and our own communities. It could trigger us in different ways, and then we don't really ponder things deeply, and could trigger our persecution complex or our inferiority complexes or whatever. But it's a real grace to be able to just meet something as it is, so that we can really get our minds and our hearts around something that is unavoidable. So we're going to be talking about religious communities in Canada that have a history in the residential schools and on the negative colonial impact upon Indigenous peoples, especially in Canada. And we really acknowledge that this is a sensitive, very touchy issue for us who have come to these communities long after these events have occurred. But as we all know, the after effects of these times are very, very much present with us. And just to get into this, you may find this a little amusing, but we're just going to initiate ourselves into a way of approaching how these type of things can affect us. So I want to tell you an amusing story about when I was a seminarian. I was going to school out in BC, and part of our program, we're studying literature and English. And so we went to Chilliwack because the college there was putting on a production of one of Shakespeare's plays, and we were studying it. So we decided to go. And it was in the springtime, and in BC, it's wet and cold all the time there. And we all had colds and sore throats. So I was in this dark theater, and I had a cold, and I could feel a sneeze coming on. And so I was fishing around to find which one of my pockets I had my handkerchief in. And before I could get my handkerchief in place, I sneezed a huge wet sneeze into the hairdo of a lady sitting right in front of me in the theater. And I was so embarrassed. Even just thinking about it right now, my cheeks are probably turning red. And I was embarrassed at myself. I was embarrassed for this lady. Everything. It was just, I just felt so, I just profusely apologized, and she was very, gracious. And, but as I even tell that story now, I can feel a little bit of the burning embarrassment, the discomfort in my face. And embarrassment, when our cheeks turn red, you could call that a little mild moment of inflammation, as our face kind of telegraphs the indignation at ourselves, that something really embarrassing just happened. We didn't get control of ourselves. And so there's a kind of an inflammation, a little burning right there on our cheeks. And when something like that happens, that may feel humiliating, embarrassing, there's two main directions we can go with it. One is to suppress it and to use our own force, our own energy to kind of lock and press down the whole thing. But we can also permit ourselves to feel the embarrassment, to just meet the humiliation that has just arrived. And so when we do that, we're actually welcoming ourselves. We're meeting our silly little selves, vulnerable, contingent. Sometimes we have it together, other times we struggle. We just are meeting ourselves as we are when something has happened that we wish didn't. And you could go back in your history and think of something that happened in high school or at the first dance you went to, or who knows, and permit yourself to kind of go through feeling that as a little model of how to meet some of the graver humiliations that will come to you in your life. When I was later, when I was, in my 50s or something, I came to learn that one of the members of my family who were living in Holland before my father's family immigrated to Canada had made some business deals to buy up some apartments that had belonged to Jewish people who had been sent off to camps. And when I learned that, I became angry. I was shocked. I felt indignation and humiliation that one of my family members that I've known was trying to, and perhaps did, profit from the Holocaust. And at first, the reaction is violent. What were you thinking? You idiot. How could you? And that's kind of a natural response. But the time came for me when I chose to feel the humiliation, the embarrassment, the shame that one of my relatives tried to profit from the Holocaust. At another time, the other part of my family came to Canada in the early 1900s, and they were given homesteads in Saskatchewan. And they began to farm their 160 acres to clear the land. And I began to hear other stories about Indigenous community called Thunderchild First Nation. And I remember hearing my mom's family talk about Thunderchild being around where they farmed. And I'd also heard a story that Thunderchild First Nation had been given an area of land to farm and to use, but some of the local immigrants were complaining that they weren't using the land well. And so government officials arranged to have Thunderchild First Nation moved to another place with inferior land, and immigrants were given the land that they were using. And I became very interested to find out. I had to know, did my family get this land? And I just had to know. And what I found out was that my mother's family were living in the place where Thunderchild First Nation was moved to from around the Battleford. So then I almost breathed a sigh of relief. But then later I thought, yeah, but all the Indigenous peoples were moved off the land that they had known forever, and were given reserves, which are usually not suitable land. It's usually swampy, sandy. It's not the greatest land around. And so what difference does it make? My family prospered at the expense of the Indigenous peoples. And when I really began to absorb that, it was kind of like a punch in the stomach. But I continued to swallow that very dull, aching truth. And the longer I was able to swallow it and to just accept that these are the facts that happened, the more and the longer that I did that, I began to feel more and more freedom to simply say that my family prospered at the expense of the Indigenous peoples of this land. So what I'd like to do is to just help us as people, and then the next chapter in this kind of grief pilgrimage I was on was as I joined the missionary oblates. I joined a chapter of the oblates that were of German ancestry, and they were ministering to immigrants and German-speaking people who had settled in the northwest of Saskatchewan. And the chapter of oblates that I joined didn't have a history with residential schools. But as we began to merge different oblate units across the country, we began to inherit, you could say, the historical legacy of the other provinces, and the other generations of oblates would come to Canada. And that included the legacy, the painful history of the residential schools. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate ran most of the residential schools in Canada. And as we have learned in these last 15 or 20 years, those schools were a great source of national trauma and cultural dislocation. And as a church and as a religious community, it's deeply, deeply troubling that institutions that were founded for evangelization of peoples became the major players in this marginalization of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So one of the things, and what I hope that we're going to share with you are some principles or some ways of approaching this very complex time in Canadian history and in church history. And I just want to give what I hope are some really good guidelines for approaching the issue as a whole. And whenever there's something like this, there's going to be stories that come from many different sides of the experience. And one of the things we have to be careful of, I would say, is it's almost a little bit like when two people are really arguing, and they've been arguing about something, and someone else comes and tries to sort out the situation. They may say, listen, I don't care about the details at this moment. What I want to know is, how do you believe you can meet one another in peace? How can you get to the most important truth of your relationship, given this dispute, what's happened? When the matter of the residential schools comes up, some people wanting to be faithful to the church will, kind of in a defensive way, justify the existence of these schools and the work of the church in them. And they'll say, well, these people needed to get an education. They got an education in these schools. And some people who went to those schools will say that my days in the school I went to were some of the best days of my youth. Another person will say, my days in those schools were the worst days of my youth. So some people will report a good experience. Other people will report a very negative experience. But as leaders, and in a sense, societal leaders and church leaders, religious really need to be able to see the essential shape of these schools and to be able to make a very sound judgment about them. So Rezebeth, you can just click to the next slide, please. The very first, and what I want to do is set us up to see how these struggles of one race with another are always with us. As long as there's societies, in plural, there's going to be tensions. In the very first recorded instance of racism in the New Testament is in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, during those days, when the disciples were increasing in number, the Hellenists, that is, the new Christians of Greek origin, complained against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. So the response that the church took afterwards was to elect the order of deacons. And this was to resolve the problems in getting everybody the charity that the community was distributing. So when we look at the residential schools, if you can just advance to the next slide. If you can go there, thank you. The best judgment, go back one, please. The best way for us to approach this is to see that what happened in the residential schools was that the government of Canada legislated that children would be separated from their families. And every priest in history knows this little bit of scripture off by heart. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So that primarily speaks of the spouses, but the one flesh is most dramatically shown in the children. The children are the one flesh of the husband and the wife. And so the government of Canada legislated to separate what God had joined together in the integrity of the human family. And so the integrity of the family and therefore society was shattered by the many, many generations of Indigenous children that were separated from their God-ordained unity. Pam, I just need to ask you to stop for a second. Susai and Vernie, I'm just recording an online conference. I know I don't have a door on this thing. Could you guys just thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't have a door in my room. Okay, so I'm gonna restart where I started talking about this. Okay. In the beginning, when the government of Canada was struggling to learn how it was going to manage the Indigenous peoples, and once all the buffalo had been killed off on the prairies, The tribes had no more autonomy. They didn't have any more. They didn't have their own source of life in terms of a food source. And so then they began to enter into treaties with the government. And the government created these residential schools, but at first they weren't mandatory. But no one was going to send their kids there. And so after that, the government made it mandatory that Indigenous peoples had to send their children to these schools, which were at great distance from the family. And so the children would be at these schools perhaps from September or October till perhaps the next summer. And there were some instances when children remained at school all year and sometimes for several years consecutively. So this scripture that every priest in history knows off by heart. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And there's no more dramatic example of the one flesh of the husband and the wife than the children. And so, in legislating that children should be separated from their parents, the government was legislating to divide what God had joined together in the integrity of the human family. And this then began to dissolve the integrity of Indigenous societies. People didn't think of that in those days when they would read this scripture. But if you settle on that one phrase, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So when we ponder that scripture in relation to the residential schools in general, we can say that this was an evil system. It never, ever should have existed. Period. And the churches never, ever should have been involved in them. Sometimes when I'll say that in a homily or in public or during conversation, people immediately challenge me. Father Mark, how can you say that the church was so deeply involved in an evil system? When you build a building and you put a cross on the roof and you have a religious superior, a timetable, in the heavy, heavy authoritative culture of Catholicism over centuries past, all critical thinking is suppressed. And as Catholics, we can choose to quickly pass over this and move on to something more positive, or we can choose to feel the hurt. We can choose to feel the grief that our ancestors in faith didn't see this. Next slide, please. one of the most severe rebukes and warnings that Jesus ever made. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. Occasions of stumbling are bound to come, but woe to the one by whom the stumbling block comes. The residential schools in Canada created generations and generations of little ones, kids, who stumbled because of being separated from their natural guiding traditions, their parents and grandparents, their family living on the land, and being enclosed in these great wooden buildings, not very sanitary, crowded together, sickness breaking out in the earliest days, especially tuberculosis. They began to stumble because all the supports for living the life that they were to live were removed from them, and they were put in a foreign environment. And ironically, at the same time as many of my oblate brothers were writing down Indigenous languages and translating the scriptures into Indigenous languages and syllabics, at the very same time as they were composing hymns, traditional Catholic hymns, and translating them into the languages of the tribes, at the same time, other oblates were forbidding children to speak those languages and punishing them for doing so. If you could advance the next slide, please. Now, the religious communities, they had members working on the reserves and in their home communities. Then they also had members working in these schools, and they would talk together, and they'd share stories, and they could see that the whole culture, all the communities were stumbling. That the children who left these schools came home and they began to struggle with their grief and losses and trauma, particularly with violence and addictions. So they knew this was not well, this was not good. But the courage to act in a new way was not there. And so it's almost as if there was a collective practice of willful ignorance and passivity around this whole issue. It's almost as if everybody would kind of sigh and just hope, I just hope this doesn't blow up on my watch. And they would just try to take care of people's superficial wounds and not really deal with the deep, deep errors that had occurred. And so the scripture about Jesus talking about spirituality and reconciliation, when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. So the religious communities, the churches ignored what had occurred here and what they knew had occurred to the peoples. They could see loosely the connections between these schools and the traumatic effects that they had on the culture as a whole. But the churches really did not move towards the indigenous peoples. And in Canada, the way that the things worked out is indigenous peoples began in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to go to lawyers and tell them about the abuses that they'd suffered in these schools. The lawyers brought lawsuits to the federal government, who named the churches as co-accused, you could say. And so the churches had to be taken to court to really begin to deal with this. And so we need to really feel the grief of that. That we who had been entrusted with this message of reconciliation for all peoples, we knew what it was going to cost us. And there was a collective ignoring of this entire matter. So as a Catholic, just as a Christian, when we look back and recognize what the harms that have come to the first peoples of this land were largely set in place by Christian people. Most of the immigrants who came to this country were from Christian nations. The people who formed the government of Canada were nearly all Christians of one denomination or another. And we have to recognize how little our true faith shaped the way that we collectively related to the people who were living on this land from time immemorial. So understand this is quite heavy. I've kind of sometimes I describe myself to people as I'm kind of a grief commando. I don't know, somehow when I first started in the seminary, I just fell in love with the Paschal mystery. And I kind of saw it really as the essential dialectic of all recreation. And so I kind of bring this to this issue. The Paschal mystery really is what we need. And I might just conclude here with talking about a scripture that I haven't actually put on the slides, but it's one of the post-resurrection moments where the disciples are going fishing. And maybe that's a little sign of they really don't know what to do in this post-resurrection time. Maybe let's go back to what we know how to do. Let's go fishing. And then someone on the shore says, throw the net over to that side and you'll find some. And then you drag in all these fish. You know who it is. And Jesus says to Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, I love you. A second time, Peter, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. The third time, Jesus says, Simon, do you love me? Peter felt hurt. Peter felt hurt that he had asked the third time, do you love me? And so Jesus leads Peter through a reconciliation, reflecting, mirroring Peter's denials, the dramatic protest, I will never deny you. 3 times before the cock crows, you'll deny me. So Jesus gently takes Peter through this reconciliation, and it's painful. Peter feels hurt. And in that hurt, there is the promise of the change of our chemistry. Because we all sin, and we know we all sin, but what we hate most is when it comes to light and we're seen to be sinners. That's when we really either go into denial or pointing the finger at somebody else. It was your fault that I got into this situation. But we are the only ones who can choose to feel the hurt that belongs to us. And if we do, our chemistry is changed. And there's a great reason to hope that you're not ever going to let that one happen again. And that you'll start looking around and seeing where something like it is still happening. And what are you going to do to change things before it gets too bad? So when we can embrace this in a Paschal way, we're being true to our deepest traditions. The whole Bible is self-critical literature. I'd love to do a study someday to just see how many actual verses are verses of critique against the faith community by members of the faith community, namely the prophets. Like how much, what's the percentage of that massive book we carry around that is the community correcting itself? I bet you it's more than 60%. But you know, when someone speaks of this in a community meeting, you can just feel the electric tension and the energy. Like, just don't talk about that. Don't say that. You're making the church look bad. And that is such a common sentiment. But when we can meet these things in a very courageous way, then We are being true to the deepest traditions of our faith. It's a paschal journey, and the more you learn how to do it with the small things like sneezing in somebody's uh, hairdo in Chilliwack, the more you can learn how to swallow that grief and let it ferment and change you, the more you'll be able to do that with the big, big challenges that are coming to us as a church. And could you just advance the next slide, please? The last scripture I want to read is more promising. It's from the book of Revelation. They sing a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals. For you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God, saints of every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests, serving our God, and they will reign on earth. That's the future. That's where we're going. And the energy to get there is the love of God for every one of us. And what we ignore and what we deny holds us back from this. And so it gives us courage. It gives us hope to be able to validate what Jesus was slaughtered for, to admit that we're prejudiced, that we have violent histories, that we can be incredibly defensive. But all those things keep us from God. And so thank you for paying attention to this. I know it's been heavy. But these few biblical texts can help us to form our evaluation of what has happened and how we can come to terms with the Christ who is the one who always suffers from our sin, and our brothers and sisters in whom he suffers. And as we do that, we acquire this resurrection that we have been promised. So thanks, everyone. And I'd like to invite you to be attentive to Rezebeth and her reflections on coming through this paschal passage in her life as a young religious and a student.
Okay, so I just wanted to kind of give you a very brief personal context of where I was or where I am around this issue. So I came to Canada in 2008 from Philippines, and at that time I didn't have any clue whatsoever that I will be entering religious life. In those days as well, I didn't really know much about the history of colonization in Canada. Never knew much about the indigenous peoples. And so that's how lacking I was in terms of knowledge of the history of the Canadian church. In 2015, I came to Edmonton for a come and see, and I was invited to attend an event. I believe it was organized by the Our Lady of Guadalupe Circle. Now, during that event, I didn't really understand much about the issue, although I myself came from a colonized country. But that was the first time I became slightly aware that there are issues between Indigenous communities and the Church of Canada, particularly with the religious congregations. Fast forward to May of 2021. I was in my final year of finishing a bachelor's degree in social work. At the same time, I was in second year of formation as a temporary vowed sister. It was then that the news of the discovery of 215 unmarked graves in Kamloops, BC, um, emerged in the news. And so, even before the emergence of this news of unmarked graves happened, I was already feeling the weight of being in that environment, in the environment where you have a lot of you're talking about social issues, and not only from the past but even today, and all the gray areas that I have to deal with. But with the help of my sisters in the community, with the help of prayers, a lot of prayers and personal reflections, I was able to overcome that and decide to stay in the program. So, as I learned and heard in university about what happened in the past, the role of the Canadian Church, particularly of our religious congregations, communities, in the residential school system, I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt, shame, and sometimes I also felt targeted. Not because I was targeted by my peers, by my teachers, but like Father Mark here, it was very uncomfortable to know what happened in the past. It was very uncomfortable when um, there's discussion of residential school system every day, almost every day during the time that I was, in university. And it was sort of like in your face. So yeah, I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt and shame. And so I've already said that during the early days of my social work degree, I was questioning whether I was in the right ministry. But when the news of the unmarked graves happened, I began to question my own call to religious life, and I began to question my membership in the community because we were involved in the residential schools. I think it hit me differently that time back in 2021 because I learned more about the historical facts, and I had peers who told me about their stories about their families. And so it became more personal for me. So I was struggling. I really was struggling. But what helped me is there are many factors that helped me. So the residential schools is an extremely difficult topic, and it was exacerbated by the news of the discovery of the unmarked graves. But within my community, it was very helpful to know and to hear stories from some of our elderly sisters that there's a sense of ownership. Some of them told me we had good intentions, we really did, but our community was complicit to something that never ever should have happened, which was the residential school system. Many of the issues that our indigenous communities are facing right now rooted from the residential school system. As I heard um, my sisters talk about their experiences in the past and how they understand the pain, the suffering that it had inflicted on some of the people. They modeled for me how to really sort of enflesh that our charism. Our charism is to be providence to others, to other people. But in order to be providence to other people, we needed to understand, to empathize, to know what other people are suffering through or going through, to know their pain and sorrow. And that is the only way that we can extend the compassion of our mother of sorrows. And so that modeling for me was very, very powerful. And it sort of, it gave me a bit of comfort that they're not denying, so because it doesn't help when you deny something that is obviously, um, as Father Mark had said, it's an evil system. Another thing that really helped me was having people within the community who can understand, who I can speak with openly, boldly, without any filter. People who would say, it's okay, and that we understand what you're going through. I remember having a conversation, a very lengthy conversation with one of my sisters who was part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I remember telling her, with everything that's going on, I'm beginning to question whether I'm in the right place. And she told me, I think you're in the right place because you are asking questions. And at that point, it made me think that it's okay. It's not wrong to believe what happened in the past and to even advocate for our indigenous communities. It's not wrong. I'm not choosing sides. It's also not wrong to identify yourself with um, the religious communities, historically seen as people, members who inflicted pain on other people. And so having that assurance that I can speak my mind, I can tell them what I was feeling was very comforting for me. As an apostolic religious, I also found it helpful to rely or also rely on my external community, which at that time it was my community in the university. So one of my teachers said to me, because I was very, in my reflections that I would submit to them, I was very vocal about the guilt I was feeling. And one of my teachers said to me that guilt is a normal response to something painful. But guilt, dwelling in guilt, is sort of like self centered because you're focusing your attention inward. Like you're turning the attention inward. The focus is always on you, on yourself. And so she said to me, instead of dwelling in guilt, you need to process, as for what Father Mark had said, you need to let yourself feel the pain, the embarrassment, the shame. You have to go through all that emotions. Only then can you actually overcome um, what's going on inside of you. You're able to process it. And my teacher said to me, once you're able to process it, then you go to work to turn your attention towards the other person in front of you. And in doing so, you are then able to work towards reconciliation, which is now I believe it's becoming sort of like a motto, reconciliation, because reconciliation is an ongoing process. It doesn't end when Pope Francis came here. Has to be constantly. There has to be things that we need to do. And another thing that was very, very instrumental in how I processed things was understanding that the residential schools era is a systemic issue. When I was having this conversation with Father Mark and we were preparing for this workshop, we both agreed that, there's no point in saying this person abused this person, or there are many people so and so who did well, who did good for the kids, because then you're trapped into the circle of defending or denying, right? And it doesn't help the situation. I had to understand that the bigger picture approach, this that the residential schools um, is a systemic racism. That was the culture back then, the culture of supremacy, the colonial mentality. And it didn't stop in the residential schools. It went on towards the 60s, 70s coup. And at this very age, we're dealing with a lot of issues that rooted from that time. And so I had to understand that, you know, that we sometimes we can't help it before, but we have the chance to do better at this time and age. I wanted to I wanted to quote I don't know particularly who wrote or said this, but this is a very famous quote that said that what happened in the past is not your fault. But now that you know better, you have the responsibility to do better. And finally, what helped me in overcoming that sense of guilt and shame is knowing myself. And that is not a personal effort. That is years and years of formation, which started when I entered religious life. Even I would say the moment I was raised, in my family, that is already a formation in itself. But more importantly, when I entered religious life, I discovered things that I didn't know about myself. And so the years of formation, having the right mix of people within the local community with whom I can um, talk and brainstorm, people who would tell me what's good, what's going good, or what's has to improve. And at the same time, I didn't know that completing bachelor's degree in social work is also a personal formation in itself. So I would say that I was very fortunate to have two solid formations. I learned more about my initial responses, and my initial response to this was flight. Am I in the right community or am I in the right call? Um, but I was given the right tools to regulate that response, and so that was really very helpful. And so to conclude my sharing, I wanted to say that as I reflected on this workshop and as I recalled my experiences, and and as I heard Father Mark and the scriptures that he used, we can see that the church is a self correcting community. And so there is hope in that. We need to stay hopeful. The Lord continues to call. Vocation work is not easy. Formation is not easy. I should know. I'm a sister in formation. Um, the Canadian church is in a delicate position, but there is hope. There is hope. Pope Francis has come to Canada, or had come to Canada, to do that long-awaited apology. And so, to some, it brought comfort. To some, it's not enough. But we can only do so much, right? So, but right now, I would like to end with a, something that my professor had told me. And this professor claimed to be not a religious, but spiritual. And she said that Jesus was the most radical social worker of his time. And I found that very helpful because it, again, you know, as long as I focus on Jesus as my model, there will always be hope. And that there will always be hope for the church to correct itself. So thank you.
Thank you, Rezebeth, for sharing the journey of a young person coming into a new country and confronting something that had affected your homeland as well, and seeing it with fresh eyes, and especially in the curriculum, the world of university, of academics, where in a way you were marginalized. You were a minority person, and it's a powerful experience to be a minority, even a marginalized, a kind of outcast in a sense, because it gives us a deep sensitivity to those other people who are outcast among us. Thank you. Rezebeth, if you could just click to the 2 slides of the books. I did want to share a couple of resources for people. 2 books. This is a very concise summary of the residential school history in Canada. I think it's about 300 pages or so. It's drawn from much of the testimony and documentation from the many, many volumes of information that was collected through the 6 years of the TRC process in Canada. And you can also get this as an audiobook and just listen to it. The next slide is the other book, 21 Things, is a shorter book, but it selects those particular features of government legislation that have had the greatest impact on the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And among all those things are the legislation of the residential schools, and it gives you a very quick introduction to some of these very powerful things that have impacted the first peoples of our country. They're very good reading. They're short. This one's not really that long, and it's also available as an audiobook. Thanks everyone for having listened to us. And we know this is kind of heavy, but I really, really want you to believe that your heart can expand to accept this. It's not pleasant, but if you make a practice of accepting this, and we'll never ever know all the truth, we'll never ever know how bad it was and how good it was, we'll never know all the details. But your heart is able to enlarge, to accept the grief that you're able to appreciate. And then your heart remains larger, and you'll be able to handle even more profound contradictions with not a precise judgment, but with a vast mercy. And that'll help us to avoid doing things in the present that may be causing great harm to people in our swell. So thank you all, and thank you, Rezebeth, for sharing. And I'd like to just invite us to go to the last slide. Let's, wherever you are and whenever you're tuning into this, let's just conclude this presentation by praying and saying these words of revelation together. They sing a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals. For you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests serving our God, and they will reign on the earth. Thanks, everyone, and blessings on you as you continue with our conference.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to thank you all for listening, and a special thank to both of you, Sister Rezebeth and Father Mark, for sharing your rich experiences and insight about this topic, the weeds and the wheat, vocations and communities with painful history. And also thank you for what you do in the church and our First Nation peoples, especially here at the Archdiocese of Edmonton. Once again, in behalf of the National Association of Vocation and Formation Directors Conference Committee, thank you so much. Please stay tuned for more.